Some of you may become somewhat uncomfortable as parts of this film unfold, but I think if you listen carefully...
Nature was intended
Today,
to
everybody
A healthy, happy sex life is the most wonderful and exciting. We've all experienced curiosity about ourselves and the opposite sex. Who hasn't?
Hello, my lovelies. I'm Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
Today we're talking about contraception, also known as birth control.
We're remedial sex ed.
Holy wow, I screwed up.
Whoa.
That's like a whole new level of not being able to do the intro right. Let's try this again. And welcome
to Remedial Sex Ed.
Today we're talking about contraception, also known as birth control. Ever since human beings learned that pregnancy could lead to sex, they have been trying to make it not that way. The oldest and definitely riskiest method is the pull-out method. This has been around since before history was a thing. Other various materials and natural remedies have been attempted throughout the years. Ancient Egyptians would use honey or crocodile dung as a barrier over the cervix. In China, they would drink a mix of oil and mercury, which don't do that for so many reasons. There is mixed documentation on when the condom was first invented. Many claim Italy in the mid-1800s. However, there is mention of using lamb or goat intestines or bladders.
Gross.
Yeah. In ancient stories and legends, including in Homer's Iliad. An ancient early form of a diaphragm was a sea sponge soaked in vinegar. Our listeners should not attempt any of these ancient forms of contraception because, for the most part, they didn't work. We don't really see reliable birth control, particularly options that can be used and controlled by a woman, until the 20th century. There are many reasons for this. Sex was not openly studied in the scientific field until the 1900s, thanks to psychiatrists such as Sigmund Freud. The first documented, comprehensive, and uninhibited by personal belief or religious influence study of human sex and practice was done by Dr. Kinsey.
Good old Kinsey.
Yeah,
Kinsey.
of Kinsey Scale fame.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Kinsey founded the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University in 1947. And around the world, various women's rights movements began taking hold in the first half of the 20th century. Birth control is so intrinsically intertwined with women's rights. The ability to choose when we are ready to have children without repressing our sexual urges has impacted the female influence on the workforce, within politics, shaping our culture, and within the individual identity itself. Marcella, what do you have to add on to that?
So I actually did a little research and I found this article on PBS about the pill and women's liberation movement. And what was fascinating to me was at the very beginning, feminists were actually against the pill because it was really being used by men going to brothels. So it was like... So at first the context was entirely about sex work, and so feminists were against it. And then people were for it, and it was like revolutionary, and women had control of their lives, and everybody loved that. And then everybody was like, wait, why are women the only one responsible for taking care of this? And so it was like controversial again, and I guess it's still controversial among feminists. So what was interesting for me was like seeing the journey of the pill and how it was associated with feminism.
It's interesting. So Sarah Kinsey, who we interview...
No relation.
No relation. We interview her for this episode. She recommended the book, The Birth of the Pill by Jonathan Eig, or Eig. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
Sounds about right.
It lightly touches on how birth control and condoms were mostly, the knowledge for that was mostly held by prostitutes. Mm-hmm. And how the pill was kind of sold to the general public was, instead of using it as a form for women to enjoy sex, it really was sold as a women's rights issue of saying you shouldn't be expected to be a continuing baby factory.
Yeah.
So I think the pill kind of has its role in feminism based on how you frame it and the context you give it.
Yeah, but one interesting thing we learned in the book, which I highly recommend. What's it called again, Meg?
The Birth of the Pill.
The Birth of the Pill. Really interesting stuff. We've been listening to the audiobook because we're in SF right now. So we took
San Francisco!
We took a quick trip. So we listened to it in the car yesterday. It's very fascinating, and we learned how the development of the birth control pill is almost inseparable from both women's rights, suffrage, and the temperance movement. How all of those sort of those seemingly disparate interests sort of can coalesce around women's reproductive rights, or rather, they didn't coalesce. But they all had a hand in in leading to the development of the pill and its acceptance. Because there was so much backlash against any form of birth control, condoms, which were around since the late 19th century,
No, so
or the early 20th.
that's where it gets a little tricky. So in Italy, scientists brought together kind of a fabric encasement to help prevent the spread of syphilis. And that's where a lot of people credit the mid 19th century, but people have been, as I mentioned before, people have been using animal entrails as a makeshift condom since forever.
Gross.
But I mean, that's what lambskin condoms are made out of.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah.
Gross.
Just
That thing that I touched last week.
Yeah, it's just a bratwurst casing.
So, in today's modern world, women have a plethora of safe, reliable options for contraception, which, thank you, scientists and activists.
Thank you, science.
Now, Sarah did such a good, thorough job on explaining these options that this is going to be a long but very informative episode. Let's jump right in.
Now, when the baby's ready to be born, it stretches up to be about this size, just big enough for the baby to slip through.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for speaking with us today. Is there any way... So, who are you?
Yeah, so I am a first-year medical student at the University of Utah. And prior to this, I worked at a sexual and reproductive healthcare clinic for 3 years. So you can think of it like a Planned Parenthood, but it was not called Planned Parenthood. It had a different name because it was an independent operation, but same funding sources as a Planned Parenthood and same basic idea, mainly focused on birth control.
We would love an overview on what the birth control options are that are available on the market. Is there any way that you could go through each of them and talk about their effectiveness rate?
Yeah, definitely. So we can start with the most effective and kind of work down, and then I'll send you to, if you want, this little PDF that has them kind of a comparison of them by tier. So they kind of rank them in tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 in terms of effectiveness. Mm-hmm. So tier 1 things are going to be 99% effective, and that's kind of you're working with somewhere between 99.2 and 99.8 or 99.9, but all very effective methods. So that starts with sterilization, so those are going to be the non-reversible methods. And you have male and female sterilization. So female sterilization, you're talking about tubal ligation, and then male sterilization is typically a vasectomy. And then IUDs.
So can you also give the layman term for the female sterilization?
Oh, yeah, sure. So there's a couple different options for female sterilization, but the most common one is called tubal ligation. And so that's what people refer to as getting their tubes tied, which they do not tie your tubes, but they do make a cut in your tube, in your fallopian tube. So then you've got LARCs, which are long-acting reversible contraceptives. So those are things like IUDs and the implant. And then for IUDs, you have hormonal and non-hormonal. So the hormonal options are going to be Mirena and Liletta, which both of those are good for 5 years. Kylena is good for 5 years, but it's a smaller sized IUD. And then Skyla is smaller sized as well, and it's only good for 3 years. And the amount of hormones in those guys are going to vary depending on how long they're good for, and their size. And then you have the non-hormonal IUD, which we just have the one right now, which is Paragard, and that's the copper IUD. And all of those are in the 99% effective range. And then you have the implant. So people typically talk about the Nexplanon. There is another one called the Implanon, but I think it's not used quite as frequently. It doesn't show up on like radiographic imaging because it's like the Nexplanon is radio labeled, and this one it has some kind of like barium or something in it so you can see it. I'm not sure exactly what, but so the Nexplanon has been the preferred one. So if you need to be able to find it, you can. And that guy is good for 3 years. And again, 99% effective. So then these are kind of your tier 2. So these are going to be in the like 90% effective range. And I'll give you the exact percentages. So the first one is an injectable contraceptive. So that'd be like the Depo-Provera shot. And that one you get every 3 months. So basically 4 times a year. And that is going to be a progestin only. So all of the IUDs that we have just talked about are progestin only. The Depo is progestin only. And then going down from there, you're working with things that are called combined contraceptives. So they have an estrogen and a progestin in them. So there's the patch and the ring, both of which are kind of a once monthly formulation. So you're going to have it on or in for 3 weeks and then out for 1 week. And those, oh, I skipped the percentages. Okay, so the Depo-Provera is 94% effective. The patch and ring with typical use are 91% effective. And then you have pills, which are also 91% effective overall. And again, these numbers are kind of like, they're taking into account like how easy is it for people to typically use them. So what does typical use look like? And then how effective is it with perfect use? So, and then like for pills, there's all of these different formulations. So it's kind of like this number is taking a broad average of all of those. And you could really dig into, if you wanted to, certain pills or certain formulations of pills are going to have like 92 or 93, and some are going to be, less than that. So just kind of keeping that in mind. And so for pills, there's 2 options. There's a combined oral contraceptive. So that's going to be estrogen and progestin, but there's also what they call, so the acronym for that one is COC, combined oral contraceptive, and they also have POP, so it's a progestin only pill. And that one, the effectiveness is a little bit lower because you have to take it a lot, you have to be a lot more strict with when you take it, but the benefit of that is it's good for people who can't have the estrogen if they don't want to do one of the other options that are progestin only. So there's that. And then tier 3, you're going to be working with things like condoms. So there's internal and external condoms, or sometimes people call those male and female condoms. We kind of tried to steer away from that at Bridger Care just because sometimes people who use male or external condoms might not identify as male. People who use internal condoms might not identify as female. But condoms, you're looking at like 85% effective at preventing pregnancy, but they're also really great for preventing STIs, which I'm sure you guys covered. So definitely something to consider using with any of the other methods that you're doing. Diaphragms are going to be 88% effective. You do need to use them with spermicide. A cervical cap, it can be difficult to get the placement correct. And then it depends on whether or not you've already had kids. So they call that parity. So if you're nulliparous, meaning you haven't had any kids, the effectiveness is higher than if you have had children. So there's a range there between 71 and 86% effective. And you want to use those with spermicide as well. There's a sponge, which has the spermicide already built into it. And that is going to be between 76 and 88% effective. And then you have just spermicide on its own, which is at 71% effective. And then just something to be aware of with that is that any of the ones that use spermicide can irritate the vagina, and that irritation can actually increase your risk of STIs. So these are great ones to make sure that you're using condoms with. And then there's fertility awareness. So that's between 76 and 88% effective, but it can be tricky to really get nailed down. They tend to recommend using some kind of a backup method for the first, depending on what source you consult, they say 1 to 3 months to sort of get a sense of when you're ovulating, and you really need to be on top of that. And then if you are combining, so there's like a calendar method, a temperature method, and a method where you're looking at your cervical mucus. And the people who have the best success with this are combining all 3 of these, or at least 2 of these methods, to really track their ovulation. And then the last one, and this is kind of, they don't really put it in a tier because it's kind of its own deal, and that's breastfeeding. So if you are breastfeeding every 4 hours during the day and every 6 hours at night, you will stop ovulating. And so that's called, what they call that lactational amenorrhea. And if you're not menstruating, then you're typically not ovulating. And so for the first 6 months that you're pregnant, you can be doing this as long as you're breastfeeding as frequently as that says, and as long as your period hasn't returned. So if one of those 2 things is off, either you're feeding your baby formula sometimes, or you're not breastfeeding as frequently, or your period is returned, then you want to talk to your doctor about some other method of birth control. But if you're following all of the guidelines, breastfeeding can be like 98% effective. So it's really effective as well.
Okay, I've actually never heard of the breastfeeding option, but maybe it's because I don't know how to phrase this. Like, you need to not have birth control in order to have that birth control.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And a lot of times, like, it's hard this is like really for women who are interested in, using this method. I think a lot of women end up just starting something right away because they're not really sure that they can commit to that. And then there's some evidence that, like, if you had to return to work and you breast pump, that it might not have the same effect on your ovulation as like the baby actually sucking on the breast. So they don't really know why that's the case, but if you're going to be like breast pumping, then people typically are starting some kind of other method. So it's like, I think the people who really are able to use this and do it well, it's a pretty small group.
So are there any health reasons why women should choose one form of birth control over another?
Yes, for sure. I feel like this is like, we're in such a great era for birth control because of this, because they're like, every body is different. And so like, just what works for somebody's body really might not work for somebody else's body. And we saw this all the time in Bridger Care. Like, and sometimes it's like, it really is a matter of trial and error. Like, you're not going to know until you try it whether or not it really works for you. And that's kind of this like unfortunate thing that we all have to go through. But so definitely just in general, like, there's so much individual variability. But there are certain things that we know for sure, if people have these conditions, we're trying to get them onto certain types of methods. So if people are smoking, if they have hypertension, heart disease, liver problems, if they've ever had breast cancer, if they get migraines with aura, all of these are things that make us want to go towards something that doesn't use the estrogen formulation. So something that's not a combined, so something that's progestin only. So an IUD is a great option for people like this. The breast cancer, actually, I'm not sure. It depends on what type of breast cancer they've had. Sometimes certain types of breast cancer, they want to do something that's completely non-hormonal. And sometimes if the breast cancer is only like estrogen positive, then they can just avoid estrogen. And sometimes the breast cancer is positive for neither estrogen or progesterone. And so there's a little bit of like, I'm lumping that into that category, but just know that each of these, there's really kind of some sussing out that needs to be done. But in general, these are kind of red flags for providers to look into doing something that's progestin only.
You talk about the difference between progestin only versus progesterone and estrogen options. So I started my birth control options on the pill, mm-hmm. and really struggled with kind of hormonal imbalances with some of them. Mm-hmm. And then when I swap to an IUD, I have the Mirena, which has progesterone in it, but it totally eased everything out. Is that because women can be more sensitive to estrogen?
Yeah, so the estrogen, some people are more sensitive to it. And then the other thing is, so I have an IUD also, and I love it. The other thing about the IUD is it has about, depending on which IUD you get, a 1/7 to a 1/10 of the progestin that is in birth control. And the reason it can do that is because it's acting locally at the uterus. And it's kind of this continuous release. So you're talking about like literally a 1/10 of the, like you're talking about none of that estrogen that was in your body with the pills. So you have none of that systemically affecting you, and you have a 1/7 to a 1/10 of the progestin. So that's like, just on a physiologic level, it makes sense that that's not going to have the same systemic impact. And then the tests that they've done have shown like what's acting locally in the uterus is probably at that level, but what's in your bloodstream is less than that. So you're really not going to have, if the hormones are an issue for you, it's not going to act in the same way.
Outside of diaphragms, cervical caps, and kind of the tier 3 options, is a copper IUD the only non-hormone based birth control in kind of tier 1 and tier 2 options?
Yeah, you're really looking at the copper IUD, or like, sterilization is technically non-hormonal, or one of the tier 3 options like condoms or a diaphragm. Yeah.
Some women experience pain with the IUD going in, and the women that I've talked to who have experienced pain, usually it's with the copper option. Is there any truth to that statement, or is that just bad luck?
That, I think, is bad luck. So there is, I saw a ton of IUD insertions when I worked at Bridger Care. So one of my jobs was to hold people's hands through those procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like always this guessing game. We were trying to tell like who would have pain with this insertion and who wouldn't. And it's really hard to know. I think anxiety definitely plays a role. Like if it makes physiological sense. So your cervix is really meant to be a one-way opening. It's meant for things to go out and not in. And so some people's bodies just really kind of clamp down and go, no, that's the wrong direction. You have made a mistake. And we definitely saw that people who came in really anxious and kind of already like clenching and bracing had some, like, were more likely to have some of that pain. But then sometimes it's really, there's not a lot that you can predict. There is, some of those smaller sized IUDs that I was talking about, the Kylina and the Skyla, are not just smaller, they're smaller like once they unfold in terms of the like width of the IUD, but in terms of like the diameter of the inserter, they're actually smaller like in that sense too. So sometimes people with a smaller uterus might have better luck with the Kylina or the Skyla, not just because of the size once it's in, but the size of the insertion device and this, like the diameter of the IUD itself is smaller.
I don't want to scare people away from IUDs. I also have one. I love it. I know Marcella has one. She loves it. You've already spoken to your own. So we're definitely a lot of IUD fans on this podcast, but I just kind of want to give our listeners a heads up that that's not always the case. Is it possible for like an IUD to get twisted while it's inside, or for the placement to get screwed up and cause pain afterwards? And it can get twisted either while it's being inserted or once it's inside. The likelihood of that happening once it's inside is fairly low, but the during insertion, that is definitely a possibility and something that they work really hard to avoid. Some people are good candidates for an insertion of an IUD with ultrasound. So people can have like retroverted uteruses or cervixes that have like, I had a friend who had a cervix who has like literally a 90-degree bend in it, which is just, it's really just like
bad luck, like, and so people like that are going to be better off getting an ultrasound guided IUD insertion. And so that could be part of it for some people. And it may just be like, and most of the time they're doing this without an ultrasound because of the cost effectiveness of it. So it's a lot cheaper, right, if you don't use the ultrasound for the patient. And then the hospital doesn't have to bill that. It's a whole system. But sometimes, you're putting an IUD in the same way that you would for everybody else, and it turns out that this person's uterus is tilted or something. So the arms of that IUD are poking into their uterus, and that, as you can imagine, is painful. Like, it's very painful. So I think, in the time that I worked at Bridger Care, like, we didn't see a ton of that, but it's definitely not completely out of the ordinary. And sometimes, like, once you already have the IUD in, depending on where you go and who you see, people have more or less experience with this, which is sort of like an unfortunate piece of the medical field. Some people are, able to, like, kind of correct that without taking it out. And some people really think that the only way to correct that would be to take it out and, like, redo the insertion under ultrasound guidance. So, and then some people are like, well, you're just not a good candidate for the IUD. You should do something else. So it's unfortunate, but your answer to what you should do about if you're having pain with an IUD will really vary depending on who you talk to.
Let's keep unpacking some of the tier 1 options. What is the different? How does an implant work?
An implant is going to be 68 milligrams of etinogestrel. So that's like the IUDs, the highest amount you've got is the Mirena, which comes in at 52 milligrams of levonorgestrel. So those are both synthetic progestins. And it is good for 3 years. So basically what you've got is a continuous release of that progestin only, that's basically regulating your cycle and sort of preventing ovulation, and then also helping to thicken your cervical mucus. So it's like another barrier for sperm to enter if it can't get through the cervical mucus. And that is good for 3 years. So the blood quantities that you're going to see with that are between, like, initially, like, circulating in your blood, you'd have between, like, 60 and 70 micrograms of progestin a day, and that drops down to, like, 30 or 40. And if you compare that to the IUD, like the Mirena, which has the highest, the Mirena and the Liletta have the highest amount of progestin, you're seeing like 20 micrograms a day that declines to like 10 micrograms. So the next one has to have that high, if you compare it to pills, it's really just a slightly higher level, but that slightly higher level is because it's not acting locally at the site of the uterus. Does that kind of answer that question?
Kind of. So is there the same amount of potential pain associated with the implant that there could be, not usually, but could be with the IUD?
I haven't talked to a lot of folks that have pain with the implant, just because it's going in your arm. And there's not, the anatomy of that is a lot easier to, like, feel as a provider before you're putting that in. And so, like, avoiding any sort of structure that might be, harmed or damaged is a lot easier to do. So I don't think that you typically have people coming in with a lot of, like, pain in their arm after the Nexplanon. They do have to, like, avoid certain activities for a little while and make sure not to let the site get infected. But not really seeing a ton of, like, pain with those folks.
For a male vasectomy, is it reversible?
The answer is kind of.
Okay.
So, depending on, like, the source you consult, you're going to see that it's reversible somewhere between 50 and 70% of the time. But what we know is that things that make the vasectomy more likely to be reversible is that you've had one for less time. So the people who've had one for, like, less than 3 years, I think the reversibility is pretty high. More than that, it's probably not. And then even in those people that it's been, like, less than 3 years, that likelihood is it still depends on the method that was used to do the vasectomy. So basically, what they're doing is they're clipping like a small piece of the vas deferens, and then they're either cauterizing it or ligating it, which involves like putting a kind of clip on it. And so depending on like basically how that procedure went, you might have more or less ability to reconnect those two pieces of the vas deferens.
I once heard that a vasectomy is a safer procedure than getting your tubes tied. Is that true?
Yes, it is. So a vasectomy is safer, it's less costly, and it has a shorter recovery time than tubal ligation. Unfortunately, most of the sterilization that is done, I guess I don't have a number in front of me, but the majority of sterilization that's done is tubal ligation. So there are fewer vasectomies that happen every year than tubal ligation procedures.
Oh, that's boo.
I know, it's not what you want to hear. And there's a lot of reasons for that.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The shot, was that tier 1 or tier 2?
They put that in tier 2.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move into tier 2 then. So how frequently do you need to get the shot?
Every 11 to 13 weeks. So from the date that you got your last shot. So I definitely this is a misconception. People will come in when they've started to bleed again, because a lot of times with the depot shot, you're like going to have amenorrhea. So usually the first depot shot, you'll have like some spotting and bleeding, and then after like 1 or 2, people typically don't have a period at all while they're on the shot. And so then the signal sometimes to people to come back in would be that they'd started bleeding again. And a lot of times that's too late. So you really want to catch it before you've started bleeding again. So really counting that 11 to 13 weeks is kind of your window. And I think some places they'll even do it for you as early as 10 weeks. But what's recommended like on the depot packaging is 11 to 13.
So with the shot, is that something you always have to get done by a doctor, or is it a kit you do at home?
If you get trained in how to do it, you can give it to yourself. It is tricky because you need to make sure. So there are 2 options. There's an intramuscular injection and a subcutaneous. So the depth of the needle and where it goes, and making sure that you're not hitting any nerves or vessels on the way in, is something that like can be tricky to learn to do. It's not impossible, and we definitely had people who could do it. The other piece of that is you have to be comfortable poking yourself. I remember we had one patient who was like a female firefighter who like wasn't gonna, like she was gonna be gone all summer, and she was like, you just need to teach me how to do this because I want to be able to like just take this with me and do it while I'm out in the field. And she did it under the supervision and guidance of one of our RNs a couple times, and they were like, yeah, she's got it. So she was able to do it on her own. I would say she was kind of a special case, and that I think you have to kind of be ready for the responsibility that all of that is. But it's definitely an option for some people.
Let's dive into the pill. The birth control pill is probably the most famous form of birth control out there. So you have to take the pill every single day at the same time. But if you're traveling internationally or frequently between time zones, how strict is that time you must take the pill every day?
Yeah, so it depends on the pill that you're taking. So if you're taking a combined oral contraceptive, so something that has estrogen and progestin, the timing is a little less strict. So yes, it's best if you take it at the same time every day. But if you take it within the same day, like if you take it at some point that day and you take the next pill at some point the next day, you're probably going to be fine. And if you miss like one pill, they just say, okay, that's fine. Take 2 the next day. And you want to space them out a little bit. But if you've missed 2 days or more, that's when you need to think about using some kind of backup method of contraception. The progestin-only pill, on the other hand, you really do have to take it at the same time every day. And if you've missed that window by more than 3 hours, you need backup contraception. So that's a lot more strict than the combined method. And so, yeah, for some people, and I remember like trying to figure this out with a patient before, like was she in the window because the times had changed and it was this whole thing. And it's honestly like really tricky. And we were both sitting there staring at the calendar confused. And so I think maybe if you know that that's going to be an issue for you, maybe the progestin-only pill isn't the best method for you. But I'm sure that there are people who could get really good at it and make it work.
Are there any medications that will cause birth control pills to fail?
Yeah, there are. So anticonvulsants like seizure meds, certain antibiotics. The only one that comes to mind is I think it's called rifampin. And a lot of antibiotics don't impact the pill because they're not acting on those liver enzymes. But that's the kind of thing where if you're getting an antibiotic and you're on birth control, just ask your pharmacist. They know. They always know. They're geniuses. So the pill is processed first by your liver, and then there's usually kind of an activation and an inactivation step. So it's processed by these liver enzymes called the cytochrome P450 enzymes. And so anything that's acting on those enzymes could cause problems with the activation or deactivation of the pill. Antiretrovirals, so people who are on HIV, medication for HIV, some of those can act on those liver enzymes. And then one that's not prescribed but is something a lot of people take is St. John's wort. And so St. John's wort can act on that same liver enzyme as well. So that's a good thing to be aware of.
For those who have never seen birth control pills, they either come in a little circular disc, or I've always had the ones that come in a rectangular pack, and they're laid out by week. And the 4th or 5th week, the last 5 days, are sugar pills. How necessary is it to take those sugar pills?
Depends on what's in them. So there are certain birth control pills that have iron or something in them that are helping you kind of replace the iron that you lose during menstruation. And so those ones, it would be good to take that if you can tolerate it. And a lot of times, really what they're having you do is just get in the habit of taking something every single day.
When I was in high school, a lot of girls would say that they were on birth control to either regulate their periods or help out with acne. Is there any truth to that statement?
Absolutely. Yeah. So most pills prevent ovulation. And the way that they do that is they level out the hormones estrogen and progesterone. And so if you're having heavy bleeding with your periods, having those levels be more closely regulated can significantly reduce bleeding for people with heavy periods. Those hormones have been tied to acne control, so that's definitely a possibility as well. That can help with acne. And then hormonal contraceptives are one of the recommended treatments for people who have endometriosis. So there's definitely a lot of reasons that people might use birth control pills that are not for contraceptive reasons.
How does the birth control patch work?
Kind of the same way as the ring. It's going to be a combined estrogen and progestin, and it's getting released slowly over time into your bloodstream, and it's regulating your estrogen and progesterone hormone levels. So same sort of idea as the pill or the ring. You have the ring in, it's going to be basically 3 weeks on, 1 week off, just like pills or just like the patch. So you're having 3 weeks of active hormones and then 1 week where you're not using them. And some people, I'm sure you've heard of people continuous cycling. So they are skipping those weeks where they would have a period. And that's totally fine to do. Make sure you talk to your doctor about things to watch for with that. But there's no real reason that, I'm sure as you can tell if you have the IUD and you're having that constant stream of hormones, a lot of people aren't having a period at all. And there's no reason that anybody needs to have a period. So it's totally fine to do that as well. Just go straight to the next ring or the next patch or the next pack of pills.
Let's go on down to tier 3. So basically with the cervical cap, the sponge, and the diaphragm, you have to insert these yourself before having sex, and then when you're done, they come out?
Yep, that's the basic idea. So it depends on which one you're using. You're actually supposed to leave it in for a certain amount of time after sex. And that's basically to hold that spermicide in against your cervix so that any, sperm that are really feeling like survivors that day just have to go through the spermicide and die. Or it slows them down, at least. Yeah, they all work with spermicide, and they're basically like different ways of making a physical barrier as well as a chemical barrier with the spermicide to prevent the sperm from getting into the cervix.
So how far do you have to insert? Like, again, I've never used it, so I'm not the best person to comment, but is there like a clear stopping point for a cervix cap or a diaphragm when you're inserting it?
Yeah, so I actually I had a lot of issues with hormonal birth control as well. So I had a period of time where I was using a diaphragm. You can get a feel for it. It's a little bit tricky to learn how to do, and it can be kind of uncomfortable because you're like in a room with a medical provider that's showing you how to take it in and out and then checking to make sure you've put it in the right place. So that's like, if that sounds really awkward and uncomfortable for you, then maybe this isn't the option for you. But for me, it was definitely like worth trying. So what I had used was the diaphragm. So what you do with that is you're going to spread spermicidal gel around the outside ring, and then you put a little in the very center. And I think it's the same for the cervical cap. So around the like perimeter, and then a little in the center. And then with the diaphragm, you sort of fold it, and I'm gesturing, but you can't see me. You kind of fold it and twist it. And then a lot of times what helps is like most women can feel their cervix. And if you're curious, or if you ever want to check your IUD strings, what you can do is you can put one foot like up on the bathtub or the toilet or something, and you'll get kind of like into a squat position, and then you bear down a little bit. So like kind of like think of going like that. And then you'll reach your fingers up there and you can feel your cervix. If you have a really long vagina or short fingers, you might not be able to feel your cervix, but most people with a little bit of effort can reach their cervix. So for me, that was the way that I could get the diaphragm up in the right spot, was that you really like reach up there. You've got one foot up on, the bathtub or something, and you like kind of reach up there and you can feel it sort of hook, and then you push the other side up. And so it's really sitting like up against your cervix. And what I've heard, and that it was not, I will say this, it was not always easy, and I wasn't always sure that I had it in the right place. And so when they have like that range for this diaphragm and the cervical cap, some of that is because it can be tricky to get it to sit right. And what I've heard is that the cervical cap is even harder to get placed correctly than the diaphragm. I mean, you're talking about somebody who's like pretty comfortable with their body, really not like squeamish about getting up in there. And it's tricky for me. So if there was anybody who was going to be able to do it, it might have been me. And it was tough for me too. So I think that's like definitely, and there are women who, have been using these since the 70s who are very comfortable with this and are really confident with it. And so it's still a good option for them. But it ended up in the long run, I wanted something that I felt a little more confident about.
What is your opinion on those who use their ovulation cycle as a form of birth control when they are not trying to get pregnant?
So I'm really hesitant to give an opinion on this. I think that for some people, it's a method that works. So they're using like kind of the fertility awareness method, what you're talking about. I think that, I think one thing that Bridger Carey did a great job about was really training me in just believing and trusting women. So if this is what somebody feels like is the best method for them, then that is the best method for them. And we are there to support them and help them do it in the best way that they can. But really, like, the best birth control method is the one that you use and the one that works for you and the one that you trust. So if that is tracking your ovulation cycle, then let's make you really good at that. And let's make it just so infallible for you that you have it totally down. And we can talk about like, what are the risks of that and what are the other options available. But if that's what you want to do, then like, I think our role is like to really support that and make it as, as usable as possible. Basically, there's 3 kind of ways to do it. So there's calendar, temperature, and cervical mucus. So your body temperature does vary a little bit. Like we're talking like 0.2 degrees or something throughout your ovulation cycle. So you can get really good at tracking that and using that as a way to tell when you might begin to ovulate. And then the calendar method is just paying attention to when was your last period and planning for when your next period will be and getting good at tracking that. And then cervical mucus, you're actually like reaching in and feeling the stickiness and the sort of like you take it out and kind of roll it in between your fingers and examine it. And so at certain points in your cycle, and I don't know exactly when, you might have no mucus. Your mucus might be like really sticky. It might be cloudy or more slippery. And depending on where you're at, I think it's like when it's slippery, that's when that's like the day around when you might be ovulating. But the thing to like understand about fertility awareness is that your egg only lives for about a day after ovulation. So you're really paying attention to like, or what you really want to be able to track is you need to be able to predict when you're going to ovulate. And then 5 days before that is when you're really kind of trying to 5 to 6 days. So sperm can live in the vagina for 5 to 6 days. So it's really like this period before you've started ovulating that you have to be paying attention to. And there's like, in terms of timing, there might not be that many clues leading up to that. So you really have to like be kind of catching it on the front end. And that I think is kind of where the trickiness comes in terms of people, not being like, not predicting it is going to come in, 6 days and it comes in 4 days. So then you really had sex on this day that was like maybe kind of risky because the sperm could still have been alive during that day. So, that's kind of the tricky part. And then there is some debate about like a day or two after you've ovulated. But really what you're trying to do is 5 days before the day that you ovulate and the day after. I think it's really, so like it's about 7 days that you're trying to avoid having sex.
So there is a solid week where you can't have sex, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of genetically, aren't women more horny around the time that they're ovulating, just from a biological standpoint?
Yeah, they can be. They definitely can be more like have a higher sex drive during that ovulation period. And that's not the case for everybody, but there are definitely women who have a sense of like, oh yeah, I must be ovulating right about now because they know.
Yeah. Okay. And then, so Planned Parenthood on their website lists a success rate for both kind of the fertility awareness and also the pull-out method.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you said, sperm can live in the vagina for 5 days. Yay.
Yep.
And then the egg can live for maybe a day after. And the success rates of the pull-out method do they correlate to the actual likelihood of people using the pull-out method and having like that perfect timing to when ovulation happens? Like, is there any correlation there?
So I don't know if I understand your question. So are you wondering, is there any correlation between how well people use these methods and then what the success rate is?
Kind of like a correlation between, well, we won't touch on fertility awareness. I'm just talking more about those who are really risking it with the pull-out method and how that succeeds and actually the likelihood of getting pregnant, because there is kind of a fertility rate and actually succeeding in conceiving a child.
Yes, so the pull-out method, the numbers that Planned Parenthood has on their website are kind of, I would say, less than perfect use. So those numbers can be a bit higher if you're using it perfectly. So basically, the thing about pulling out or the withdrawal method is that if there are any sperm in the like seminal tract that are left over from the last time there was an ejaculation, those could be expelled in like the pre-cum, so that like seminal fluid that comes out initially. And so even if you're pulling out, if you've had an ejaculation, and I want to say it's like within the last, I don't know, like within the last 12 hours or something, maybe it's 8, I can't remember off the top of my head, that can be carried in the pre-cum. And so you're not having, so you're not really avoiding the thing that you want to avoid, which is having the sperm be in the vagina, right? So that's part of it. And then, yes, there is a piece of the likelihood changing depending on where a woman is at in her cycle, right? So if there's no egg to fertilize and there's not going to be an egg to fertilize for the next 5 to 6 days, then, the likelihood of the withdrawal method working is higher than if they're in that ovulatory window. But I think the tricky piece is it's so hard to know when exactly that ovulation is coming unless you're like a body awareness tracking wizard. And really, like some women are just like really in tune with their body. It's like awesome. It wasn't me, but it's the right thing for some people. But and then, really trusting your partner that there hasn't been another ejaculation within, I think it's like, 12 hours or something. Because the sperm are tenacious like that. So, so really like having that dialed in. And then, I think like on their website, it says, Planned Parenthood's website says 78% effective. So that like 78%, like somebody might look at that number and go, oh, well, that's not like so bad, right? Like that's pretty good. But that's, if you think about that, that's for every 100 people that are using this method, you've got 22 out of 100 people every year that are getting pregnant.
So 78%, if you think of it
22.
in terms of like a month, that's 3 out of 4 weeks, that 1 week that you're ovulating.
Right.
That's when it doesn't work.
Yeah, exactly.
In a world where anyone listens to this, don't use the pull-out method. Like, hard no. And you don't have to say that. I'll say it. Why is it necessary for a woman to see a doctor to receive any form of birth control?
That's a great question. I think some of the stuff we've talked about already kind of alludes to this, which is that there are side effects to being on these medications, and there are, things that you need to know and things that your doctor needs to know before thinking about prescribing you any of these meds, right? So like what we talked about with the combined oral pills, if you have hypertension or heart disease or liver problems or, migraines with aura, and maybe you don't know what aura is, like ruling all that out for yourself might be tricky. And there are definitely some people who could be really good about looking through all of that information and making an informed decision. But there are definitely people who are really not at that level of decision making, or really can't, we're talking about people who have like low numeracy and low literacy, and how do you kind of make it so that fair for everybody, so that no one is going to do anything that really hurts themselves. It's like, I think that's kind of the hard piece of it, is like, there are definitely women, who've been on birth control for years and know exactly what they're going to get. And then like for them to go into the doctor every year and have the same conversation is super frustrating. But then there are other people who really need more guidance in terms of like, staying on track with that and all of that. So there's been some legislation recently, I think, that's talking about making having birth control pills be over the counter. And I definitely can see the risks and the benefits of that, right? Like if we make it more accessible, then more people will use it. But the downside of that is, it has a potential for harm, because if you're, using it and you're also inhibiting those same liver enzymes with something else, like, you could damage your liver. And that's like not something that grows back super well. And so I think that that's kind of where we're at right now and that's kind of where it seems the discussion has gone is like, okay, well, what can we expect from a reasonable person? Are we asking enough, too much of our, of the public if they were to do this on their own?
I don't know if this is because I live in California or if this is an America thing, but I'm fortunate enough that any birth control option that I go on under my insurance is 100% covered.
Mm-hmm.
I never have to pay for it. I guess my first question is that a California thing or is that an every insurance thing? Like they have to cover birth control?
Yeah, that was part of the Affordable Care Act. So part of the Affordable Care Act was mandating that all insurance companies cover at least one form of each type of birth control. So like one kind of IUD, one kind of pill, one kind of injectable, and that's kind of the at least. And most insurance companies really jumped on board with that. There was an option for insurance companies to be what they called grandfathered in. So if they had some sort of religious affiliation, they were allowed to, or the organization that they were kind of founded from had a religious affiliation, they were allowed to forego the birth control coverage piece. So there are some people who have insurance that is technically compliant with ACA rules that does not cover birth control. But for the majority of the cases, most companies have adopted the ACA policy.
So for those who are not insured, what is the cost of birth control for them?
It totally depends.
Mm-hmm.
So it depends on where you go. It depends on if you're eligible for something like a sliding fee discount. And then it depends on what option you're going for. So I think like full fee through Bridger Care, for example, which is where I worked, a pack of pills was $32. And an IUD was, depending on which one you got, somewhere between like $740 to like $1,000. And that was them selling it at a very small markup from what they could buy it at cost for. So that was like, we're trying to make this as affordable as we can for people. So like IUDs can be pretty expensive. Places like Planned Parenthood, especially if you are uninsured or underinsured and you're eligible for, you think you might be eligible for like income sliding fee discounts, that's definitely the way to go, because I think depending on where you fall, you might qualify for like a 25% discount, 50, 75, or even 100% discount. So in those cases, it's free to folks. And that's what the Title 10 funding is set aside for.
So if you are not insured and you're in a current financial place, you should contact places like Planned Parenthood. I know in California we have what's it called? I think Family Planning Association. Are you saying that if you're not insured, you should reach out to some of these organizations to see how they can help you financially?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's definitely options out there, and even outside of that, there are a couple national pushes for like things like LARCs, the long-acting reversibles. So the Mirena, like I know Mirena IUD, if you have a certain income that doesn't maybe meet Planned Parenthood thresholds or whatever the thresholds are for the like federal Title 10 funding, but you really can't afford it, you can apply for like a Mirena grant, and if you're within a certain income threshold, they'll give it to you. I know Bill and Melinda Gates were doing something in Colorado with this, and I think they had some funding available for people who were interested in LARCs. And then there's also like usually some different states have some different state funding available to kind of cover the gap between people who maybe are on Medicaid and people who can really truly afford coverage through the marketplace. for insurance. And I know that that was the case in Montana, that they had a program called Plan First that covered contraceptive services for people who were kind of in that gap. Utah, I think, doesn't really have a program like that. But so again, kind of can vary from state to state, but there are definitely options available. And a place like a Planned Parenthood or some Title X family planning clinic would have good information. They usually have people that are trained in like maximizing people's insurance benefits or finding them any possible funding source. So they're a good kind of like go-to resource.
Do teenage women who can't talk to their parents about sex have an option to get on birth control without adult consent?
It depends on the state you're in. It depends on the state rules. So I know in Montana, if you were, I think it was 15 or between 15 and 18, you could self-consent for contraception, but not for something like the Gardasil vaccine. So it depended on what you were kind of seeking. And I think California probably has similar laws, but I think there are like states where teenagers can self-consent, and states where teenagers cannot self-consent. For Utah, a minor who is married can get a prescription for birth control without parental permission. All other minors must get a parent's permission to receive a prescription.
That's just fucked up on so many levels.
Yeah, that's definitely frustrating.
I'm sorry to swear in front of you.
No, you're totally, I'm not offended by swearing.
That was my knee-jerk reaction to that statement.
Yeah, whereas it looks like in Montana, all minors are allowed to get a prescription for birth control without a parent's permission.
Okay.
And let's see what it is in California. Also, teens can get a prescription for birth control without parental permission.
Gotcha.
Yep. So there's the website I'm on, in case anybody's curious, is sexetc.org, sexetc.org. And it has the like rights for LGBTQ rights for HIV testing, the age of minority, the age of consent, and rules about consenting for birth control and emergency contraception. So that might be a good one to look into.
Do you have any other advice to give women regarding birth control?
Oh, birth control is so great. I want everyone to find, I really do. I want everyone to find the birth control that is going to like work the best for them. And I think that my advice is to advocate for yourself. If you feel like something is not working for you, don't just abandon it and give up on birth control altogether, and find a medical provider who you feel like will listen to you and hear your concerns out, because they're real and valid. Even if people tell you that they're not, it can be really frustrating, and it feels like you can't find something that works for you and you're worried about the side effects and all of that. But speaking from experience, when you find something that really works for you, it's a really good feeling, and it's worth putting some effort into.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for meeting with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to hearing the show.
You remember how big my tummy stretched when the baby was growing in there? And now see, I'm flat again.
Marcella,
Yeah.
do we love birth control?
Yes.
This episode was super, super fascinating and helpful for me. And I think Sarah is she's so fun to interview because she's very enthusiastic about what she knows and very, I think, approachable, which is really important.
Yeah, she seemed really nice.
Yeah, it's really important as a woman to have someone that you can feel comfortable with discussing these options.
I was very impressed. She was so knowledgeable.
We previewed this interview with a couple friends just as we were listening to it in the car, going around doing things, and everybody learned something. I definitely learned a lot, but I think everybody we showed it to learned a little something, and it sparked a lot of discussions.
I know men flat out don't know about it, but like there's a lot of women who really don't know everything as well.
Yeah, I mean, like, I've got to say, this is probably the first time where I felt like I had a little badge of honor because I knew about each one of the birth controls that she mentioned. That didn't mean that I knew how they worked, so I learned a lot about it. But I was like, hey, tick, I know this one. Check, I'm not totally useless. But I just really appreciated her going into depth as to, like, how they all work. And side effects of each one of them, talking about the different, like, progesterone and estrogen and all. Yeah, she's great.
So I know she kind of briefly mentioned some of the side effects, but I don't think we went into them in super great detail in the interview. And I think a big part of that is, you know, as a woman who's been on various forms of birth control, I get it. Like, complaining about the hormonal shifts that you go through with some of them, or complaining about the weight gain. You know, there are certain women with high blood pressure who flat out can't go on some of these options because it is dangerous. But that being said, in many cases, the side effects are actually, I think, not as severe as some people think they are. And Marcella, what's your take on that?
This is another case of I don't know my body, which it also made me giggle that she mentioned in her interview how, like, she's not that aware of her body as well, which made me feel validated because she's in med school. So some of us are just less aware of our bodies and we need to work on it, but I'll get there. I only remember one instance where I could feel the birth control really affecting me. And that was when I went from a brand name pill to a generic pill. And it was supposed to be, they're supposed to be all the same thing, but my body just reacted to the generic pill so differently. I was very hormonal. I had so many mood swings, which I really have never felt like I've experienced that in my life, other than trying that. So it's interesting to me because I think it's hard to tell people what the side effects are because it's so dependent on everybody's bodies. Each one of us reacts so differently. A lot of the time, I try to avoid talking about any issues that I'm having. Like, I'm very much if you ignore it, the problem will go away when it comes to my health, which is very, very wrong, and don't do it. Monkey see, monkey no do. I think it is important to have that kind of open relationship, which is why I think it's so great that, Sarah's interview was so open and it was so easy talking with her. And I think that'll make her a really excellent doctor because you want somebody like that in your corner that you feel comfortable talking about all of these different things happening in your body.
Marcella, have you felt any pain with your IUD?
I didn't feel any pain.
Neither did I.
Yeah. Well, actually, that's not true. I didn't feel any pain with the Skyla. Apparently I have a tiny uterus, and so they wanted me to do the Skyla for my first one. And then I went in, and the next time, when the Skyla expired, I got the Mirena, and that hurt so bad. And I think that I'm going to go back to the smaller IUDs in the future because that was painful.
I have the Mirena, but everyone's a bro down there. I do.
What does that even mean? All IUDs work down there. We're bro.
She's got like 3 of them.
Yeah.
Great.
Really scared about pregnancy, guys. No, it didn't. I didn't feel any pain, and I mean, I don't notice it at all, other than the fact that I don't have a period anymore and I'm not pregnant. Those are the things that I notice.
Megan, that's actually a really interesting point. I've actually never stopped having my period. I still have mine every month.
Oh.
Really?
Yeah. For a while, it was less so. With the Skyla, I had it less frequently. I was literally having a period once a quarter, maybe. But I've always had really, like, my period has never been regular. That's the thing that I miss the most about birth control. The birth control pill is it's the only time in my life that my period has come, like, regularly. And so, yeah, that it doesn't change your cycle for everyone. I'm one of the people that it doesn't, but yeah.
And that is something we pointed out in the interview as well. Like, a lot of teenagers use it for that particular health purpose, and it's not a lie. Like,
No.
I think a lot of people, when they heard that from a teenage girl, automatically assumed that she was down to clown, but it is actually used for that reason.
I remember the day that I called my mom and told her that I needed birth control, and her response was, "Oh, for acne. Okay, I'll schedule that," and hung up.
Nice.
Sometimes it's best to just let your parents believe what they want to believe.
Yeah, and she 100% made sure that I got what I needed, but it was very sweet that she needed to believe something else.
It's okay. Sometimes, you know what? I get that.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
get that.
Yeah, yeah. I still count that as awesome mothering. She did what she needed to do. Colin, I have a question for you about IUDs.
For me, okay, yes.
Do you ever feel it when you're having sex with Megan?
Sometimes I think I do, but then it could just be anything.
Other things floating in Megan's vagina?
Yeah. Never, oh boy.
I have an entire
Or it could just be
arsenal
an
of equipment
illusion.
down there.
Oh yeah, it was, as we said, she's got like 3 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sometimes think I feel it, but what would I actually be feeling? With like the strings or but not the thing itself, because that goes in the cervix, right?
You might be feeling the base of it. It's like it's
Okay.
got a little plastic tip, and then the 2 little strings will come out of that. So, I mean, it might just feel like a poke or something is what I've heard in the past.
Okay.
So, I was just wondering if you've ever felt that. And I hear that it's definitely dependent on position because it all has to do with, like, depth and all of that good stuff. So,
Yeah, so then going by that description, then yes, I've felt it, but it's never been like a problem. I just sort of shift and it's not a problem.
how painful is it when you encounter it?
It's just like a sharp little, ooh, a poke is a good description.
Okay.
Like I could see it if you're really getting hot and heavy, like if it jabbed you all of a sudden, that might hurt. But I don't think it's really anything to worry about. Like I've never yelped in pain during. I mean, maybe in a good way.
Yeah.
Colin,
Yo.
prior to this episode, what did you know about birth control?
I just knew the basics. Like, I knew the different types, and I knew that there was hormonal and non-hormonal birth control. Like, I knew about the IUD. There were the different types. Or I guess I knew that there were... I thought that there were 2 different types of IUD. There was, like, a hormonal version and a copper version. Yeah. And I had heard about a subdermal implant. I had heard about the patch, but I didn't really know how either of those worked. And I had also heard of the sponge and diaphragm and all those insertables, but I had no idea how they worked. Just seemed like black magic to me. But now I can see how with the spermicide and proper use, I can see how they work.
So do you think men should know more about birth control?
Oh, definitely.
Do we think it's hilarious that there was development for a male birth control pill and it got basically ended because the side effects were the same that women have been dealing with for decades?
So I don't know this story.
Oh yeah, This
Really?
is a true story.
I think every woman knows this story.
Oh, no.
Megan, how much would you trust the man to be in charge of the contraception? Yeah.
1,000% no. Like,
Right? But men give that right to women every day.
yeah.
And obviously they aren't, like, Colin's not going to get pregnant, so there is that much less of an effect on his life. But, I mean, Colin, I'm so fascinated with, like, how comfortable you would have been allowing somebody else to have the complete control of that.
Yeah, and this is something we talked about, just Megan and I, a little bit in the car yesterday, is that I do think there are a couple male birth control options that are being developed and are pretty close to hitting the market in the U.S., I mean, relatively speaking. So that's exciting, and I do think that men shouldn't have to trust somebody else's word to prevent becoming a father. Mm-hmm. How do I want to phrase this?
I think historically speaking, gender roles have not been great.
No.
And so when it comes to motherhood and taking care of children, it comes to motherhood, historically.
Yeah.
You know, we don't really live in that world anymore. It is beginning to shift. Or I say we don't really live in that world anymore. We still kind of do. We definitely do.
Definitely do.
Yeah.
But it's shifting to be more of a two-parent household. Mm-hmm. And that two-parent could be any form, whether it's a mom and a dad or two moms or two dads. You know, the whole idea of raising kids is just completely shifting. Mm-hmm. And so I think historically it has been so much put on the woman because at the end of the day, she's the one carrying around this thing for 9 months. I want to clarify, I'm actually really pro-children. You know, like, pregnancy is just a whole world of suck.
Yes.
Like, and so I think historically that's why, but as we shift more into this broader spoke of raising a child, I think there is more to be put on a man and his, whether or not he's ready to be a father. Mm-hmm.
And with increased responsibility, so I do think that men need to take more responsibility for birth control, but with that increased responsibility comes increased freedom, where you don't have to rely on somebody else's word.
Yeah,
and
I totally agree. And having two is better than zero.
Yes.
Like, you know?
Yeah, you might as well, you know, they're both 99% effective, so we might as well use two and try to get it as close to 100 as possible.
So women, at least in their younger years, the responsibility of having birth control is so put upon them.
Because the stakes are higher.
Yes, very much so. But in, let's say, a committed monogamous relationship where both partners have had the kids that they want in their lifetime, and the older you get as a woman, there's various forms that become more dangerous for you. Mm-hmm. So it kind of gets into this shift of a conversation that once you've had the kids you want, is it now upon the man to get a vasectomy, which is like the ultimate form of birth control. And a vasectomy is so much safer than tubal ligation.
It's just so easy. It's an outpatient procedure. They don't put you under. It just seems like a no-brainer that the vasectomy is the easier option.
So, Colin, in the future...
Mm-hmm.
In the future times.
I mean, probably, sure, yeah. I mean, yeah.
So once we've had our 5 kids?
1.
3.
1 child. 2 children.
2.5.
Get me out of here.
So once we've kind of decided that we're done scarring the world with the demon seed that will be our spawn.
Sure, which is why I think we should do 2, just to replace ourselves and not burden the earth.
I'm not even thinking from a sustainable standpoint. I'm just thinking, think of the hairy child.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. We don't want to unleash on this earth more than it can handle.
So once we're done with that, would you consider it?
Yeah, of course. It's kind of a no-brainer. I don't know. I've never put a lot of my self-worth into my ability to have children like some men do. So while we're talking about it, there are actually some chemical birth control options being developed right now for people who have a penis and testicles. There's one that is in human clinical trials in India that is actually an injection, and it acts kind of like a temporary vasectomy. So you inject a little blocker. Okay, let me actually pull this up because I don't want to sound like an idiot.
I mean, I do all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's my wheelhouse. So.
Have we counted the amount of times I say a surprising amount in these episodes?
Oh, where'd it go? I swear I had it in a tab. In a tab.
I have so many tabs in front of my face.
I've got a lot of tabs open. But it's an injection that gosh dang it, I was so prepared. I did my homework. I listened to the interview.
I believe you. I recognize you.
Did
You're good.
everything right.
You did.
Okay. This is from verywellhealth.com, so not an org, but fairly reliable. Okay. A male birth control shot has been showing very promising results for decades. It's called reversible inhibition of sperm under guidance. It's an injection that is offered through clinical trials in India. Current clinical studies show that this male birth control shot has been shown to be 99% effective, about on board with other forms of female birth control. And it's non-hormonal, minimally invasive, reversible, and can last for 8 to 10 years. So like I said, it's like a non-permanent vasectomy. And so what's it called again? It's called RISUG, or reversible inhibition of sperm under guidance.
Is it removable? Like if you decide within that 8? Okay.
And it's kind of fascinating because I don't think they remove it. They just like do another injection that dissolves it.
Oh, cool. Science.
Science.
So the birth control shot injects a non-toxic polymer known as Vasal gel in the United States. That's the brand name that is currently being tested here in the U.S. So, set up a Google alert for Vasal gel when that comes out. And you insert it right into the vas deferens, which is the little tube that they remove in a vasectomy. And the polymer attaches to the inner wall of the vas deferens, and when sperm goes through it, it kills it. I'm not quite sure how that works. It seems a little bit like black magic to me, but it is, in these clinical trials, it is shown to be 99% effective. So that is pretty cool.
Any other closing statements?
Smoke weed every day.
Oh my God, we're getting divorced tomorrow. I love kids, and I do very much want to be a mother someday. Key word in that sentence is someday. I would not have the same opportunities in life if motherhood was a certain consequence of sex. I would not have gone to London. I would not have my master's degree. I would not have been able to travel the world as I do now. And I would not have the same career opportunities that I've had, because it may be bullshit, but you are expected to give more of your life at the start of a career. Birth control and contraception is such a personal choice. We can't tell you which specific one is right for you. However, I firmly believe that the right to choose when and if you want kids is a basic right every human being should have access to. I'm Megan.
I'm Marcella.
And I'm Colin.
And thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Love
You
you.
agree that the concept will contribute to the rearing of a mature person.
An absence of
Oh, yeah, you don't have to be thinking about sex.